Charbs, this video is going to be about the large-scale murals of the Ethiopian-American artist Julie Mehretu, but it's going to take me a minute or two to set up some big concepts, so I hope you stick with me. First, I'd like to say that I've technically been to Los Angeles. I've been to that famous donut place, I've walked the pier at Santa Monica, I've spent a day at Huntington Gardens, I went to the Getty Museum, I think I went to a vegan donut place, and I guess I go there for donuts. So when people ask if I've been to LA, I say, yeah, I guess. But I really hope they don't have any follow-up questions. I don't think I understand LA. I don't have an opinion on it. If you want to know about the donuts, they're great. The Getty, beautiful location, beautiful building, really well curated. But LA, I don't know about that. I've never walked around or lived there. I get in a car and I go to one place. Then I get into the car and I go to the next place. It might be impossible for me to ever really feel like I've been to LA. I mean, even the cities that I've lived in seem bigger than my experience. Maybe I know the shops and people within my old neighborhoods, but cities just seem too big to ever really know. Cities, and I guess I actually mean just places in general, they're really complicated. So complicated, in fact, I think I need another anecdote to start this video. So I was in Bologna recently, and inside this church, actually it's 7 churches, one built on top of and adjacent to the other. It's called the Sette Chiese, the 7 churches. And the original church at this location dates back to the 4th century CE. From there, it's a mix of different columns taken from different places built up over time. You can actually see the layers of history at this location. The building tells a story of the city, and that city isn't just a series of complicated locations. It's also a series of complicated relationships with the past. It's complicated spatially and temporally. So I've technically seen a Julie Mehretu painting in the same way that I've technically been to LA. I went to the SF MoMA this summer and I saw Howl, Eon 1 and 2 in person. Additionally, when I'm working on a script for a video, I usually have the artwork on my desktop background, and I've had this detail of the painting on my screen for a while. So I've seen it. I've seen the painting. But like LA, I don't really feel like I've seen it fully. I don't know if I've been inside that painting or walked its streets. These paintings are huge. So this detail that has been on my screen, I've been there in the same way that I've been to that donut shop. When I saw the 2 works in person, there were a few locations I checked out and I spent some time in, but these canvases are overwhelmingly large. There are places on that canvas that I have not been to. I'm comparing this painting to a city, to a landscape on purpose, because this is a landscape painting, for real. So to put Mehretu's landscape within the historical context of landscape paintings, let's quickly establish that context for landscape paintings in the American West. They were extremely popular throughout the 19th century, and we can spitball some reasons for why that is. It could be a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. During the first Industrial Revolution, a lot of traditional values were being challenged or simply obviated. Transportation technology issued a challenge to local production, for example. The requirement for land ownership to vote issued a challenge to the established ruling class, as another example. When these kinds of rapid, large-scale shifts in culture happen, they often are met with a romantic reaction. When the present looks dramatically different from the past, there is the impulse to romanticize the traditions of the past, an impulse to hold on to something or memorialize it as it disappears. In Europe, the Romantic reaction had an actual past to return to. Think of Wordsworth poetry or Turner paintings. They could write about or paint their ruins, tell their old national myths. But in the US, well, the nation was just too new for that kind of response. So instead, their romantic reaction manifested in a deification of nature. So there's lots of paintings of nature, lots of landscapes from this time period. Or at least that's one reason for their popularity. There are, of course, others, like the ideology of manifest destiny, making that Western horizon look as beautiful as one's ambition to be an autonomous landowner. But let's move on from that. So as the US pushed westward in the 19th century with those new technologies and industries and the creation of new states and so on, they were also lamenting the destruction of nature. The landscapes that they encountered were beautiful, and so the artists rushed to preserve these landscapes in paint. They rushed to preserve the landscape the past represents in paint before the dirty future of industry killed it. It's no coincidence that barely more than 2 decades after the gold rush, President Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act into law, preserving some of that nature and symbolically preserving the purity of the past. But, of course, nature and traditional systems of labor were not the only things destroyed in this process. Entire populations of natives were decimated by this westward expansion. This is something Julie Mehretu calls out explicitly when discussing her paintings in the SF MoMA. Noting the destruction of native communities, she says that annihilation and preservation shortly after can exist on the same geographic landscape. And to continue to quote her, she's also noted how there is no such thing as just landscape. The actual landscape is politicized through the events that take place on it. So now we can finally start to look at her contemporary landscape murals like the one in SF MoMA that I've kind of seen, at least parts of it. I feel like my intros to these videos are getting longer and longer. If they get too long, somebody please tell me. So the base of this painting is layered images of landscape paintings from the 19th century, like those of Church, Kohl, and Bierstadt. Those images are then blurred and pixelated to form the base of these paintings and then inform the color scheme. This is something that Mehretu has done before. In this painting, for example, she took an image of the fires in Auroraville, California on July 9th, 2017. Then she blurred it. Then she flipped it upside down, and she used it as the base of her painting. And just quickly to explain the name of this painting, Hineni is a line from Exodus chapter 3, verse 4. It can be translated from the Hebrew as, "Here I am," and it is a response that Moses gives to God as God appears to him in the burning bush. In that line, Moses is accepting the responsibility to lead the Israelites to the promised land, so this is a pretty heavy painting. But let's get back to Howl, Eon, the ones in the SF MoMA. After she blends those landscape images together and pixelates them, she then makes a bunch of gestural marks in black paint. These are chaotic individual actions. Sometimes they mimic each other. Sometimes they start to hint at some sort of form and then they end abruptly. Sometimes they resemble linguistic symbolic systems, but they're never truly comprehensible. And then, after making those marks, she erases some of them. She just removes some of these individual actions, erases them from her canvas, and then she decides to pull up some of the background image back to the surface. So when you decide to visit a specific section of her canvas and look at it for a bit, like I did with that desktop image, you start to realize that the act of looking at this painting is similar to an archaeology of a landscape. Your eye moves into it, but it moves into it in a pretty confusing way. You think you understand the layering, but then something will appear both in front of and behind another element of the painting. It's very much like walking around the Sette Chiese in Bologna. Columns from an earlier time period are propping up architecture from a later time period. Structures are built on top of and adjacent to one another, and it's difficult to parse the order of each of the elements. So I've moved from landscapes to architecture there, and Mehretu has explored this concept in architecture specifically in works like Stadia 2. Architecture, like landscape, is never just architecture. It carries with it the stories and actions that have been inscribed onto it by people. So that's why I had that part about the Sette Chiese in the intro. The painting is large, so you move around it spatially, but it's also complicated temporally with the layers of its production. I hope that makes sense. Mehretu will also frame certain parts of the landscape or use color and line to direct our eye in certain directions, and all this serves as a pretty interesting allegory for how history and landscapes work in our collective memories. Things are annihilated and created on the same canvas. Elements are erased, new elements created. We intentionally pull some of the past with us into the future, and she allegorically brings some of the background into the surface of the painting. We put certain frames around parts of our history or landscapes, and we intentionally erase other parts that we do not want to bring with us to the future or to the surface. We preserve some parts and destroy others, and sometimes these things happen in the same space. She says of her work that it is a battle of small marks in this long view of time. And at this scale, we're forced to recognize the impossibility of understanding our landscapes and our histories fully. The experience of gazing at these canvases is ineffable. We don't have the language for these concepts. In fact, Mehretu says that she's attempting to create visual neologisms. A neologism is there for when language isn't enough. A neologism is when a new word or expression needs to be created because existing language isn't sufficient. So this complicated idea of layered landscape that engage in both creation and negation at the same time, it's better understood beyond the constraints of language. My language, regardless of how long my intros are, will not articulate the concepts as well as her painting does. Partly, we can attribute that to the scale of these paintings, which makes it impossible to take in fully or view or understand. That size is also something of a political statement. As the art historian T.J. Demos has noted, it's a style of painting that challenges the limits of apprehension, spatially and historically, and thus defies the master, or colonial, gaze. Those earlier landscapes draw your eye to particular parts of the painting, often a vanishing point on the horizon, pulling our gaze westward. Mehretu's paintings don't have that kind of guided direction. There is no center or area of the canvas that she's pulling us towards. And when some direction is given to us, like this part of the painting with a couple of white frames, it appears to me to be more ironic or arbitrary than anything else. And I see that as a comment on the ways that some parts of our landscape are marked out as important while others with similar histories are not. Like, think about a Civil War battlefield preserved and distinguished for the acts of bravery that it hosted. Bravery attempting to overthrow a system of slavery. Well, what about those acts of bravery performed by actual slaves subverting that same system? What about those heroes who died fighting that same system with less chance of success and therefore more bravery? From that view, the frames seem arbitrary as those thin white frames in Julie Mehretu's canvas. This painting is not a history book. It's not telling us a story. It's showing us history, not telling us one. And it's an allegory for how we have constructed the stories of our past on our landscapes. I think that's why she says her task is to create visual neologisms. Language would be too prescriptive. It would directly tell us how to think about the landscape. But this canvas gives us a huge platform to explore the landscape on our own and understand the limits of our own archaeological process. I'll leave you with the artist's statement that she hopes that the viewer feels an aspect of dislocation inside the painting. From a distance, you can see the whole thing, but as you come close to it, to really see it, because it's made up of all these small parts, you don't have a sense of the whole. You're immersed in what you can see and can only make sense of it from that place. So there is no one vision of this landscape that will be correct or authoritative. Our subjective eyes from our individual positions will excavate meaning on our own and hopefully contemplate the process and limitations of individual subjective experience in our own landscapes and in our own buildings. It's a pretty great work of art to grace the entrance of the SF MoMA, a building recently renovated in San Francisco, a city synonymous with the gold rush and westward expansion. Thank you for watching, and please consider subscribing. A lengthy work cited is in the description if you want to dig a little deeper into Julie Mehretu's paintings. Thanks again.